are back working in the cardboard house today, and today I am making this cast iron Potbelly stove. This was an idea given to me by one of my patrons, Karen. She is a member of V.A.M.E, the Victorian Association of Miniature Enthusiasts, which is based out of Melbourne, Australia. They had a competition to make something with coffee pods, and Karen came up with a Potbelly stove, and she passed the idea on to me, allowed me to use it for my video, and now I'm passing it on to you. So I hope you enjoy this build of the Potbelly stove using some different items, like food-based items that would normally go in the trash or the recycle bin. Coffee pods come in all different shapes and sizes, and I didn't know this, but some of them are even made from aluminum. There's many places that you can get these. If you don't use them yourself, you can ask a friend to save a couple for you. I have these two that I have cleaned out and are ready to go. Other things that are this shape that you could probably use would be like a cap to mouthwash, or the little cups the dentist makes you take a sip out of and spit. Anything that's similar to this shape should also work. These two are going to go together to make the Potbelly stove. I also have this little butter tub, and these two come from my children's school lunches that they've been passing out all summer. And I think one is a ranch tub and one is a jelly tub. And honestly, I even think the idea would work with the rectangular shape Potbelly stove. They're all different shapes and sizes. To start off, I am going to be cutting down one of my coffee pods because I don't need all that height. I want height on one of them, and then one of them I'm going to cut down a little shorter. In order to keep this cut as straight as possible, I made little marks with a ruler going all the way around the cup, and then I'm taking my X-Acto knife and cutting along the line as best as I can. Honestly, this was not the easiest material to cut. I felt like my blade was moving on its own, and in the end I had somewhat of a straight cut, but it ended up, parts of it were kind of jagged. I tried to straighten it up a little bit with scissors, but that didn't seem to help very much either. I don't know if the aluminum coffee pods would cut a little bit easier, but these ended up being a little bit difficult. My initial plan was to try and make this a functioning Potbelly stove where the door opened and everything, but once I started trying to cut the opening in the plastic of this particular coffee pod, it ended up being, again, a very jagged cut, and so I wasn't very happy with how it looked, and so I decided to make it a permanently closed Potbelly stove, but I do think it's possible to create it so that it does open. I just decided, instead of getting frustrated with it, I probably won't open or close it very much anyway, so I'm just going to make mine permanently closed. At this point, I glued together the two coffee pod pieces, but I think I probably could have kept them unglued, and if I did have an opening door, I could have put a tea light inside of there to make it look as if there was fire inside of the stove. I'm also adding this water bottle cap to the top of the stove to add a little bit more detail. I'm using the piece that I cut off of one of the coffee pods. I'm first cutting it in half, and as you notice, I'm trying my best not to use the X-Acto knife. I think the scissors were a little bit easier to handle on this material. I'm cutting around because I want to create the door for the oven out of this plastic because it has the same curvature as the rest of the stove. I first cut it, made sure that it was the right height, and again, I'm trying to even up the edges as best as possible. Maybe I was just having an off cutting day, but my cut lines were just not good. I don't know what was going on. I then cut it to the width that I wanted, which is a little bit wider than the opening I created. I'm now cutting into the butter tub, and I'm just going to be using the top of this piece to go on top of the bottle cap. I think the top of it, just the shape that is pressed into the tub, is a little bit more reminiscent of a Potbelly stove top. But I do think that the bottle cap is giving a lot of strength here because it is a bit stronger than the butter tub. So once I get this piece glued on, there is some strength at the top, so not everything is easily crushed if anything happens to just land on top of the Potbelly stove. Make sure to be mindful. I'm using hot glue on this project, but I did find that some of the plastics reacted with the hot glue and went out of shape. So just be mindful of that. Luckily, I didn't misshape much of this project, but the heat from the hot glue can cause problems. So just be mindful of that. I'm now using a paper straw to create the smokestack or the exhaust for the stove, and I'm just gluing that straight on top of the piece of the butter tub I previously glued. The whole Potbelly stove actually needs to sit on a base that has legs that hold it up from the floor. So what I'm doing now is using some cardboard. Of course, this is for the cardboard house, so I've got to use some cardboard. And I'm starting to create a 3-tiered platform that will hold up the stove. I'm using cardboard and just cutting out a piece that is a little bit bigger and then another piece that is a little bit bigger to create this tiered stepped piece like you see here. Later on, I will add some joint compound to smooth that into one smooth transition from the bottom to the top. But for now, I'm going to use some hot glue to glue these all together, and then I will also use glue to attach the stove body to the top of the platform itself. This is also where if I have a jagged cut on the bottom of my stove, the hot glue is going to kind of fill in those gaps so I don't have any holes at the bottom of my stove. And this is how it's looking so far. Here I'm going back with the hot glue and just kind of, I guess I'm trying to make it look like a weld. So I'm adding a bead of hot glue that goes all the way around the base. To create the legs for the platform, I'm using some cotton swab sticks. So the first thing I'm doing is cutting the cotton swab heads off of each side of the stick. Once those are done, I'm going to be gluing each stick to another stick. So basically, I will have 4 sticks glued together to make 2 pairs. I'm starting out with tacky glue, but later on I will reinforce it again with some super glue because eventually I will be putting these into some water to help shape them. Once the glue is dry, I'm going to put them up against a ruler and I'm trying to get an even length for each foot. And so I am marking them at 3/4 inch long, and then I'm going to cut them into pieces that are 3/4 inch long. By doing this, I should end up with 4 even legs for my Potbelly stove. And I'm using an easy cutter here. I often get questions about this tool. I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested in finding out more about this tool. So now I have my 4 legs. This is where I decided to reinforce them with some Gorilla Super Glue. Once I put this on here, I let them dry for quite a while because I don't want any of that super glue wet while I do the next step. I'm putting one of the legs into some water for about 20 to 30 seconds. I don't want to leave it in there too long because the paper of the cotton swab will start to unravel. After it's soaked for about 30 seconds, I'm taking 2 sets of pliers and I'm starting to bend the cotton swabs into an L shape. If I don't soak them, there is a possibility that the cotton swabs will snap in half. If you do feel like the 2 pieces come unglued from each other during this point, you can re-glue them after you get them bent into shape. I'm going to do the same thing for the rest of the 3 legs that are remaining. Once I've got them bent into shape, I'm going to use my X-Acto knife to taper the bottom of the leg. So I just want it to go down to a little bit more of a point once it hits the ground, and so I just tapered them a little bit, totally optional, up to what you want your legs of your stove to look like. Once the legs have dried from being soaked in the water, I'm going to use hot glue to attach them to each of the corners of the platform. And as I'm doing this, I'm just kind of eyeballing everything to make sure that they are as even as possible. Once they're all glued on, I'm going to put it onto my table to make sure that it is not wobbly at all. You can still kind of cut down the legs a little bit or adjust them if need be at this point. I'm now going to be working on the door of the Potbelly stove. I have this really flimsy plastic piece, so what I'm going to be doing is reinforcing it with a bit of cardstock. This will also give it a little bit of thickness. The door of the Potbelly stove would have been made out of cast iron, so having it really thin doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm going to pre-curl the cardstock paper, and this is going to make it a little bit easier to glue it onto the pre-curled plastic. And honestly, I probably could have left the plastic piece off and just made the door from cardstock. So, you know, there's a bunch of different ways you could do this. That's what's fun about this project in particular, is there's so many different ways that you can do this one project. So many different shapes and so many different details you can add because there are just so many different references out there with different looks to them. Once I get the cardstock glued, I'm going to add the plastic on there, and I'm continuing to try and curl it with my fingers so that it retains the curl that the original coffee pod had. I also decided to cut it just a little bit wider than the original door. I felt like I cut it a little bit too close to my opening, so I'm taking the opportunity of adding the paper to make it a little bit wider. I also realized I wanted to add some grating or grates to the front of the door. Typically, you would be able to see through the door, and I think I kind of regret not cutting these all the way through the door and actually putting like a little tea light in there. So I think if I were to do it again, even if I didn't have an opening door, I probably would cut all the way through these grates and have a little flickering tea light in there. I'm still happy with how it turned out, but if you do decide to make it, just know that you have a ton of options and ways that you can improve upon my design that I've made here. Once I have these pieces cut out, I glued them on top of the door, and here you can see that it's not cut all the way through the door. I just have it so that you get a sense that there are some grates there, but you can't see inside the coffee pod stove. Once I'm happy with the door, I glue it straight onto the face of the coffee pod. If you want the door to open, you could make some paper hinges and be able to have it open with a little tea light, like I said before, in there flickering. I think that would look really, really cool. All of the references I was looking at for Potbelly stoves had this little door at the bottom of the stove, and from my research I realized this is the door that they take the ash out of the bottom of the stove. Once the coal or the wood burns, the ash falls to the bottom, and it's just easier to take it out of the bottom of the stove. So instead of using a plastic piece, this one I just did make purely out of cardstock paper. I added some strips of paper to the front just to give it a little bit of texture so it wasn't just a plain flat door. I made the strips of paper just a little bit longer, so what you saw was me cutting the edges of the paper off. And I'm going back and rounding off the corners just because I like the look of it. And so you can really kind of customize these however you want. Now that the doors are applied, I am taking some all-purpose joint compound, which I have used throughout this entire project. I'm using it to even out this stair-step effect that I made with the cardboard, so it looks like I have one even slope. As I'm applying the joint compound, I'm using something with a flat edge. This is just a small sculpting tool, and I'm running it along the length of the cardboard, the tiered piece, and it's smoothing it out. I actually am going to do 2 layers of this. So the first layer has dried, and I'm going to take my sandpaper and sand off any bumps, trying to get it as smooth as possible for this first layer. By doing this, I'm making a really good base to put my second layer on, and this is going to be the final layer, and I'm really focusing on these corners. I want the corners to come together kind of at a sharp, slanted point, and I just think it gives it a little bit more of a realistic look, like it's actually made from cast iron. But cast iron is also a little bit lumpy and bumpy depending on how old your stove is, so you don't have to worry about it too much. I'm now taking off some of the sanded bits, and I did want to show you this I really enjoyed this desk. It's like a keyboard vacuum. I'll put a link to this in the description box below as well, but it's really been great to have at my desk, so I just wanted to show you that my little vacuum, my favorite little vacuum now. I'm going to be using some wood glue on top of the cardboard piece that I just put joint compound on. I'm doing this because I feel like wood glue kind of levels out a little bit, and if there are some imperfections and bumps in the joint compound, it will kind of fill that in. It also gives a very plasticky texture in the end, and that translates to more of a metal look once you paint it with a metallic paint. So anywhere I had cardboard or paper, I am going to be adding the wood glue on top of it to create a very smooth surface. Plus, I don't think I've used wood glue in a while, and it's one of my favorite glues. Everyone needs some wood glue. I'm being really careful here between the bottom door and the base, and I'm using a toothpick here because the wood glue keeps touching and I don't want it to touch. So I'm trying to make sure that anywhere I am adding glue, I'm making sure that I'm keeping those spaces where there should be gaps in between my pieces. Now I'm going to be adding some details, and I'm using super glue anytime I'm gluing something to the plastic itself. I'm using these cylindrical beads to be mock hinges. So they're fake hinges, they don't work, and all I'm going to do is dip them into the super glue and then push them up against the side of the door and make sure that they are touching the coffee pod itself, so it looks like the hinges are attached. I put 2 on the larger door and 1 on the smaller door. I also need to create handles for these, and all I'm going to do is take a paper clip, bend it with some pliers, and then cut off a length. I'm making 3 different sizes. You can make them all the same size. I just I was having fun. I was just playing around with it. I really enjoyed this project, and so I was just kind of going with the flow and creating as I went. So there wasn't always a rhyme or reason, but I just had fun with it. For each handle, I'm taking the end of the handle and I'm pushing it into the nozzle of my hot glue gun, and that's creating a bead on the end of the handle. I really like the look of these. I think they're a little bit nicer looking than just a plain paper clip handle. Once I'm happy with how it looks, I let it dry, and then I can super glue it to the face of the door. So this is basically going to look like simple handles that were welded to the front of the Potbelly stove to assist you with opening the doors. I'm putting 1 on the large door, I'm putting 1 on the smaller door, so of the smaller handles I put the small one on the small door, and then 1 of them goes on the top. Now I need to go back and research a little bit why there's 1 on the top. I'm sure there's a great reason, but there's usually 1 coming out of the top, so I wanted to make sure and add that. I used a hand drill to drill through because it has that water bottle cap on the top, which is a little tougher to get through than the plastic pieces. So I drilled through there and added the handle to the top, which matches the 2 handles coming off of the doors. Now it's time for the really fun part, which is painting. Now because this is a very smooth plastic, I want to make sure and rough up the surface with sandpaper. This would have been a lot easier to do before I added the doors and the details, but it is a necessary step to make sure that the paint has something to hold on to and doesn't flake off over time. I'm going to do a base coat of black because I do want the general look of the paint job to be darker, so it's great to have a great base coat for that. Painting the entire thing with a black acrylic paint, and I'm going to let that dry. Already I think it's looking more and more like a stove, and even just left like this, I think it would look really cool in a scene. But of course, I love the painting process, so I want to try out all sorts of different techniques and see what comes out in the end. Also, I think it's at this point you can see how much the wood glue helped that bottom part of the stove be really smooth. I'm going to be using a couple folk art metallic paints. I'm going to water down the antique copper and just kind of, at first I thought I was just going to hit the highlights, but I actually do end up painting the entire stove in the aged copper paint. I also have a plain brown there, and I kind of go back and forth with a lot of the paint colors. It's not ever do this certain paint and then this one and then, you know, there's not like steps. I kind of go back and forth until I like how it looks. And of course, it's paint, so if you don't like how it looks, you can always go back and repaint it. I'm using the gold to bring out some of the details like the hinges and the very ends of the handles. I think using the gold in limited places can really bring out some highlights and details that you want to be seen when someone's looking at your project. I'm also going to be using this light brown. It's matte, it's not metallic, and so this is what's going to start to age the piece. I still want you to be able to see the metallic paint through the matte paint, and so I'm using a light hand at first, and you can see how it does add some age. It looks like either something has gotten onto the stove or it's been worn down, and I really like that effect. I'm also going to be using some watered down black paint to make it look like some dirt and grime has gotten into the cracks and crevices of this stove. This is one of my favorite parts, is aging and really trying to give a miniature a story. This is how the paint is looking so far, and there is definitely a difference between when the paint is wet and when it dries. So you can always wait for something to dry and then decide whether you need to add more or you need to do less. Here's a close-up of how it's looking. I don't really know if the antique copper, the bronzy look is accurate, but I really like how it's coming out, and I think for my fairy tale type looking cottage that is the cardboard house, I think this will work okay. I wanted to add one more detail to this piece, so I have this ranch tub that I didn't end up using for the stove itself, and I'm going to cut off the edge of it. I want it to be a basket that is holding wood kindling for the stove. So I'm going to cut off the edge because I don't need the edge on it. This actually makes it a little bit more flimsy than it actually is, which is surprising. I was going to use the plastic bag method that I made for the rug, but in that video I had a couple people point out to me, I did not know this, but bags that have this recyclable message on it, if the bag itself is recyclable, they actually end up breaking down. So it's possible that my rug will break down and just fall to pieces in the future. So if you happen to have a bag that has recyclable on it, go ahead and recycle that. If you get one that isn't recyclable, then you can use that to make crafts. I don't happen to have any of those bags, so I am just going to be using yarn for this project. I'm starting by putting down one end of the yarn, and then I'm slowly adding hot glue to the side and pushing the yarn down into the glue. You could do this with tacky glue, it just may take a little bit longer for it to dry. This piece of plastic was one that was misshapen by excess use of hot glue, so again, just be mindful of that, and if you don't want it to misshape at all, I highly suggest tacky glue, but all in all, I think it worked okay. Nothing ever like melted through the plastic, it just got a little bit misshapen. I'm going to be putting, again, a dark base coat on here. I'm using black, and if you actually have the color yarn that you want your basket to be, that kind of helps. It helps in the drying time process. I only had white yarn, so I am going to be painting it to be the color I want it to be. I did a base coat, and then I just dry brushed some brown on top of it to make it look like a very old basket that had been sitting next to a wood burning stove for a while. I went outside, I grabbed some twigs off the ground, and I'm using my easy cutter again to cut the individual branches and put them into the basket. I think that's the easiest way to make something look real if possible, just use the real thing. So the twigs were a super easy way to add a realistic looking miniature. I'm just using hot glue again in the bottom for a quick hold, and I'm just going to add the wood into the basket. And that's it for the Potbelly stove. Now it's time to put it into the house. Now I'm not quite sure where I want it to be. I kind of limited myself because I have that huge window in there. I don't know, can I put it in front of the window? I'm not quite sure. Once I figure out where to put it, I saved this other part of the paper straw because I will need to put the pipe through the wall for the exhaust of the fireplace. Also, once I decide where it goes, I can kind of decide where my basket needs to be. Can the basket sit right next to the stove, or would it get too hot? Is that a fire safety hazard? I'm not quite sure. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if you make a stove. Let me know if you improve upon it and what changes you make. There's so many different shapes that you could make this. Really, it was such a fun project. I enjoyed it so much. Once again, Karen, thank you so much for sharing your idea with me. And thank you for allowing me to share it with our channel so that other people can enjoy this project. If you do make a Potbelly stove, be sure to tag me on Instagram at Bentley House Mini so I can see what you made, and leave a comment down below letting me know what you think the next thing that needs to be made for the cardboard house kitchen. We have a little bit of space left. Have a great week. Bye.